Every empire swears its money will last forever. Every civilization believes its currency is different, special, sacred, immune to collapse. But history says otherwise, because money isn't gold, it isn't silver, it isn't even paper. It's trust, organized, fragile, and temporary. And when that trust breaks, nations don't just decline, they vanish. Rome learned this the hard way, through a slow-motion economic death spiral that took centuries to complete. Inflation, corruption, debased coins, broken promises. The fall of the greatest empire on earth didn't begin with an army, it began with a currency. And here's the part no one wants to admit. The same forces that destroyed Rome are alive right now, in your banks, in your savings, in your paycheck. You're living inside a system built on the same illusion, and when it breaks again, there won't be another Rome to fall. Long before America, Rome faced the same crisis. Too much money, not enough truth. The Romans didn't call it inflation. They didn't have economic textbooks or Federal Reserve meetings. But they lived through something far worse than any modern recession. They watched their money die in their hands, coin by coin, year by year, until an empire that had conquered the known world couldn't even pay its own soldiers. And the most chilling part is how familiar their mistakes sound when you strip away the Latin and look at the economics raw beneath. This is the story of how Rome's silver denarius, once the most trusted currency on earth, became worthless metal wrapped in lies. It's the story of emperors who thought they could cheat mathematics, citizens who trusted promises instead of studying patterns, and a financial system that cannibalized itself to survive just one more year. Most importantly, it's the story of why understanding Rome's inflation isn't ancient history. It's a survival manual for what's coming next. The Roman denarius didn't start as a trick. For over 2 centuries, it was the closest thing the ancient world had to a global reserve currency. Minted around 211 before Christ during the Second Punic War against Hannibal, it contained roughly 4.5 grams of pure silver. Roman merchants carried it across 3 continents. Germanic tribes beyond the frontier hoarded it. Egyptian traders demanded it. The coin's value wasn't backed by government promises or political speeches. It was backed by weight, purity, and the simple fact that anyone, anywhere, could melt it down and recover real silver. That physical reality made the denarius more than money. It made it truth in metal form. When a Roman soldier received his pay, he wasn't holding paper promises or digital entries in some government ledger. He was holding actual silver mined from Spanish mountains, refined in Roman workshops, and stamped with the authority of an empire that controlled the Mediterranean like a private lake. The coin's purchasing power came not from trust in politicians, but from trust in physics. Silver had been valuable for thousands of years before Rome existed, and it would remain valuable long after Rome fell. But empires are expensive machines, and Rome was the most expensive of all. Legions had to be paid whether they won battles or lost them. Roads and aqueducts required constant maintenance. Grain shipments from Egypt fed 1 million Romans who produced nothing but demanded everything. And as the empire expanded, so did its costs. More frontiers meant more soldiers. More soldiers meant higher payrolls. Higher payrolls meant greater pressure on the imperial treasury. By the 1st century after Christ, Rome was spending more on its military than it could collect in taxes, tributes, and plunder combined. This is where the story becomes both ancient and utterly modern. Faced with a budget crisis, Roman emperors could have raised taxes directly. They could have cut military spending. They could have admitted that the empire had grown beyond its financial means. Instead, they chose the path that every government chooses when reality becomes inconvenient. They decided to cheat. Not through obvious fraud or outright theft, but through the subtle, sophisticated deception that has destroyed more civilizations than war, plague, and natural disasters combined. They decided to debase their currency. The process began gradually, almost invisibly. Under Emperor Nero, around 64 after Christ, the denarius lost a small fraction of its silver content. Not enough for most people to notice immediately, but enough to stretch the imperial budget just a little further. The coins looked identical. They carried the same inscriptions, the same imperial portraits, the same official weight. But inside, where it mattered, they contained less real value. It was the ancient equivalent of printing money, except instead of adding zeros to paper bills, Roman mints were adding copper to silver coins. The genius of debasement was that it worked like a hidden tax. When emperors reduced silver content by 10%, they could mint 10% more coins from the same amount of silver. Those extra coins funded more soldiers, more public works, more bread and circuses to keep the masses happy. But the cost wasn't eliminated. It was simply transferred to everyone holding existing denarii. As more debased coins entered circulation, merchants began demanding more coins for the same goods. Prices rose not because goods became scarce, but because money became abundant and less trustworthy. What started as an emergency measure under Nero became standard practice under his successors. Each emperor faced the same pressures, the same budget shortfalls, the same temptation to solve immediate problems by making money worth slightly less. Emperor Trajan reduced silver content further to fund his wars in Dacia and Mesopotamia. Emperor Marcus Aurelius debased more coins to fight Germanic tribes along the Danube. Emperor Septimius Severus needed money for his expanded legions, so he reduced silver content again. Each reduction was justified as temporary, necessary, patriotic. Each reduction made the next one easier to rationalize. By the early 3rd century, the denarius that had once contained nearly pure silver was barely 50% silver. Merchants could feel the difference in their hands. The coins were lighter, softer, less lustrous. More importantly, they were losing purchasing power at an accelerating rate. A measure of wheat that had cost 1 denarius under Augustus now cost several under Caracalla. A day's wages bought less bread, less oil, less of everything that made life bearable. Romans were working the same hours, following the same laws, paying the same taxes, but getting poorer with each passing year. The empire's response was predictably destructive. Instead of admitting that debasement was causing inflation, emperors blamed merchants for raising prices. Instead of restoring silver content to rebuild trust, they debased even more aggressively to fund price control enforcement. Instead of reducing spending to match revenues, they expanded bureaucracies to manage the growing economic chaos. Every solution created new problems, and every problem demanded more solutions, all funded by making money worth less. This is the pattern that should haunt every modern observer. Rome's inflation wasn't caused by external shocks or natural disasters. It was caused by a government that discovered it could fund unlimited spending by systematically destroying the value of its own currency. The emperors weren't evil conspirators plotting to impoverish their citizens. They were politicians facing budget pressures, military crises, and popular demands for spending they couldn't afford. So they chose the path that seemed least painful in the short term, not realizing they were choosing national suicide in slow motion. The parallels to today are so precise they feel like historical plagiarism. Modern governments face the same pressures Rome faced. Military spending that grows every year, social programs that promise more than tax revenues can deliver, voters who demand services but resist taxes, and central banks that can create money electronically instead of physically debasing coins. The technology has changed, but the temptation remains identical. When governments can't or won't raise taxes, and when they refuse to cut spending, they turn to the printing press. Whether that press strikes silver coins or creates digital dollars, the result is always the same. More money chasing the same goods means higher prices and lower purchasing power for everyone holding that money. What made Rome's inflation so devastating wasn't just the economic damage, it was the way it shredded the social fabric that held the empire together. In a world without banks, credit cards, or government welfare systems, ordinary Romans stored their wealth in the only form they trusted: silver coins buried under floors, hidden in walls, saved for emergencies that might never come. When those coins lost half their value, then 3/4, then 90%, it wasn't just money that disappeared. It was hope, security, and faith in the future itself. The psychological impact was immediate and brutal. Imagine working for decades as a craftsman, soldier, or merchant, carefully saving denarii for your children's future or your own old age. Each coin represented hours of labor, days of sacrifice, years of planning. Then imagine watching those coins buy less bread each month, less oil each year, until your lifetime of savings couldn't purchase what a week's wages once could. This wasn't abstract economic theory. This was the destruction of individual lives, family dreams, and generational wealth, all to fund an imperial government that couldn't control its spending. Roman writers from the period capture the desperation in vivid detail. They describe soldiers demanding payment in goods instead of coins, merchants refusing to accept imperial currency, and farmers abandoning their fields rather than sell crops for worthless metal. The empire that had once moved mountains with its organizational genius was reduced to bartering like a primitive tribe. Citizens who had proudly carried Roman coins across the known world now preferred to trade in anything else: grain, livestock, foreign currencies, even crude goods that at least held their value from day to day. But here's where Rome's story becomes a masterclass in how inflation destroys societies from within. The wealthy didn't suffer equally. Rich Romans had always owned land, slaves, gold, and other assets that held value regardless of what happened to silver coins. When inflation accelerated, they simply adjusted their prices upward and continued living comfortably. The senator who owned wheat fields charged more denarii per bushel. The merchant who controlled shipping routes demanded more coins per voyage. The landlord who rented apartments raised rates to match the declining currency. Inflation was devastating for wage earners and savers, but it was often profitable for asset owners who could pass costs along to others. This created a vicious cycle of inequality that tore Roman society apart. The middle class, the backbone of any stable civilization, was systematically wiped out. Small farmers who had saved coins to buy equipment or expand their holdings found their savings worthless. Shopkeepers who had accumulated modest wealth discovered it couldn't purchase new inventory. Skilled craftsmen who had planned comfortable retirements faced poverty instead. Meanwhile, the ultra-wealthy grew richer as desperate citizens sold land, businesses, and possessions for whatever coins they could get, even debased ones. The empire's attempts to manage this crisis only made it worse. Emperor Diocletian, ruling at the end of the 3rd century, issued his infamous edict on maximum prices in 301 after Christ. This decree fixed the cost of over 1,000 goods and services throughout the empire, from wheat and wine to labour and transportation. Violators faced death. Diocletian genuinely believed he could solve inflation through sheer imperial will, by commanding prices to stop rising regardless of what was happening to the currency itself. The edict was an economic disaster that revealed how completely Roman leaders had lost touch with financial reality. You cannot fix prices by decree when the money itself is broken. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at the official prices, creating shortages and black markets. Farmers refused to bring crops to cities where they were forced to accept worthless coins at artificial rates. Trade networks that had operated smoothly for centuries collapsed overnight as people chose barter over imperial currency. The edict didn't stop inflation, it stopped commerce, which was far worse. What's truly chilling is how familiar Diocletian's response sounds to anyone watching modern governments grapple with inflation today. The same instincts, the same denial of economic reality, the same belief that political power can override mathematical laws. When prices rise due to currency debasement, governments always blame everyone except themselves. They target merchants for greed, consumers for hoarding, speculators for manipulation. They impose price controls, wage freezes, rationing systems. They create bureaucracies to monitor compliance and penalties to enforce obedience. Everything except the one solution that would actually work, as stop debasing the currency. Rome's inflation crisis also revealed another pattern that repeats in every collapsing monetary system: the flight to real assets. As the denarius became worthless, Romans who could afford it converted their wealth into gold, land, foreign currencies, and physical goods. Gold, in particular, became the refuge of choice because it couldn't be debased by imperial decree. Unlike silver coins that could be mixed with copper, gold was gold. Its value came from scarcity and demand, not from government promises. This created a two-tier economy where the wealthy traded in gold while ordinary citizens were trapped in a collapsing silver system. The parallels to modern times are impossible to ignore. When contemporary governments inflate their currencies, the wealthy don't hold cash. They buy real estate, stocks, precious metals, art, and other assets that tend to rise with inflation. They borrow money at low interest rates to purchase things that appreciate faster than currency depreciates. They move wealth offshore to more stable systems. Meanwhile, ordinary people who work for wages and save in bank accounts see their purchasing power evaporate just as surely as Romans holding debased denarii. This wealth transfer isn't accidental. It's the inevitable result of inflation itself. When governments create money faster than economies create goods, that new money doesn't spread evenly through society. It flows first to those closest to the money creation process: banks, financial institutions, government contractors, and large corporations. They spend it before prices have fully adjusted upward. By the time inflation reaches ordinary workers through higher costs and delayed wage increases, the damage is done. The early recipients of new money have already bought assets at pre-inflation prices, while everyone else pays inflated prices for everything they need. Rome's experience shows us that this process accelerates over time. Each round of debasement made the next round easier to justify and harder to reverse. Each spike in prices created new demands for government spending. Each government expenditure required more currency creation. The system fed on itself until it consumed the empire that created it. What started as an emergency measure to fund temporary military campaigns became the normal operating procedure of imperial finance. Romans stopped asking whether their money would lose value and started asking how quickly it would happen. The final phase of Rome's currency collapse came during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly disintegrated entirely. Between 235 and 284 after Christ, Rome suffered through 50 years of civil wars, foreign invasions, plague, and economic chaos. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, sometimes lasting only months before being assassinated by their own armies. Behind the political drama was a financial system so broken that it could no longer perform money's basic functions. Soldiers refused to fight for worthless coins. Citizens refused to pay taxes in debased currency. The imperial government itself began accepting payment in goods rather than its own money. This wasn't just inflation anymore. This was monetary collapse, the complete breakdown of the system that had once made Rome the economic center of the world. The empire that had standardized weights, measures, and currencies across 3 continents couldn't even maintain the value of its own coins. Trade reverted to barter. Cities shrank as commerce disappeared. The complex economic networks that had supported urban civilization unraveled as people lost faith in money itself. Rome's hidden inflation teaches us that empires don't fall from outside enemies alone. They rot from within when governments discover they can fund unlimited spending by quietly destroying their own money. The denarius that once commanded respect across 3 continents became worthless metal because Roman leaders chose short-term political convenience over long-term economic reality. They thought they could cheat mathematics with politics, outwit physics with promises, and suspend natural law with imperial decrees. History proved them catastrophically wrong. The lesson isn't ancient, it's urgent. Every government that has ever existed has faced the same temptation Rome faced, and most have made the same choice. They print, they debase, they inflate, and they transfer wealth from savers to spenders, from workers to asset owners, from the many to the few. The technology changes, but the theft remains identical. Your purchasing power disappears not through accident, but through policy. Rome fell because its people trusted their government's money more than they trusted economic reality. That trust was misplaced then, and it remains misplaced now. The empires change, the currencies change, but the pattern never does. Inflation is not a force of nature, it's a choice. And that choice always benefits those who make it at the expense of those who live with it. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore its lessons, it will crush you all the same.